There's a developing situation around the Pittsburgh Steelers right now that feels bigger the deeper you look into it, and it starts with the uncertainty surrounding Aaron Rodgers, a situation that, frankly, is not unfolding the way many in the fanbase were hoping it would. The expectation internally was never firmly locked to the draft as a hard deadline, but there was at least some level of optimism that clarity would come before then. Now, based on the latest update, that clarity is nowhere in sight. There is no real anticipation that Rodgers will make any kind of decision before the NFL draft, and that changes the entire dynamic of how this offseason is being approached. What this tells you is simple. The Steelers are operating in a holding pattern, and they're doing it willingly. This isn't a franchise being left in the dark. It's a franchise choosing patience. Rodgers, at this stage of his career, is clearly dictating the timeline, and Pittsburgh is going along with it. That alone says a lot about how much interest there is on their side, but it also introduces risk, because while Rodgers takes his time, potentially waiting until May or even early June like he did previously, the rest of the roster decisions don't pause. The draft doesn't wait, OTA preparations don't wait, and that's where things start to get complicated. You're likely not going to see Rodgers at voluntary minicamp, and unless something unexpected happens, the first realistic checkpoint becomes mid-May when OTAs begin. Even that isn't guaranteed. The pattern here suggests he values his offseason freedom, taking time away from the game before fully committing once the season approaches. From his perspective, it makes sense. He wants to be all in when he returns. But from a team-building standpoint, it forces Pittsburgh to prepare for multiple scenarios at once. And that brings us directly to the quarterback room, because this uncertainty doesn't just sit at the top, it trickles down. There's a growing belief that if the Steelers decide to take a quarterback in the middle rounds of the draft, Mason Rudolph could become expendable. That's not speculation out of nowhere. It's rooted in roster math and how this team is evaluating its depth. If Rodgers returns and you already have a young quarterback like Will Howard, who the organization reportedly likes, then adding another rookie creates a numbers issue. Teams don't typically carry 4 true quarterbacks on the roster. Rudolph, at this point in his career, is viewed as a mid-level backup, reliable, experienced, but not irreplaceable. And in a situation where the team is clearly leaning toward youth and upside behind a potential veteran starter, he becomes the logical odd man out. The return wouldn't be massive, likely a late round pick or a swap, but the move would signal a clear shift in direction. It would mean the Steelers are prioritizing development and long-term flexibility over stability in the backup role. Now layer that with the draft strategy itself, and things get even more interesting. There's been outside noise suggesting Pittsburgh could target an offensive tackle in the first round, but internally, that idea doesn't fully align with what their actions have shown. The visits, the evaluations, the types of players they focused on, there's a strong indication that if they go offensive line early, it may be more about reinforcing the interior, particularly at guard, rather than locking into a pure tackle. And that distinction matters because it reflects how they view their current roster. They're not abandoning their existing tackles. There's still belief in the upside there. The real concern appears to be inside, where consistency and long-term answers are less certain. So while the narrative externally might point one way, the internal logic suggests something different. And this front office has shown before that it's comfortable letting those outside narratives act as smokescreens. All of this ties back to the same central theme. The Steelers are navigating this offseason with flexibility, but also with calculated risk. They're trusting a process that depends heavily on timing, Rodgers' timing, the draft board falling their way, and the development of younger players stepping into bigger roles. It's a delicate balance, and one that could define not just this season, but the direction of the franchise moving forward.
So as you look at everything happening, the waiting game with Rodgers, the potential reshuffling at quarterback, the uncertainty around draft priorities, there's one big question that starts to take shape. Are the Steelers being patient and strategic here, or are they putting themselves in a position where too many variables are out of their control? What do you think? And that question becomes even more layered when you start listening closely to what the new voices inside the building are actually saying. Because the Steelers didn't just tweak the roster this offseason, they reshaped the way they want to play. When Brian Angelico stepped up and described the offensive philosophy as essentially the same structure he worked within during his time in Minnesota, it might sound simple on the surface, but there's a lot going on underneath that statement. Yes, the core concepts across the league are shared. Every team runs similar route combinations, similar spacing ideas, similar reads. But what separates offenses in today's NFL isn't the playbook on paper, it's how those plays are used. It's the tendencies, the sequencing, the formations, and most importantly, how much responsibility is placed on the quarterback. And that's where things get interesting for Pittsburgh, because if this offense leans more toward a system that puts heavier decision-making on the quarterback's shoulders, then the urgency around the Aaron Rodgers situation becomes even more obvious. You're not installing that kind of structure without having a very clear idea of who's running it. Rodgers fits that mold perfectly, a veteran who thrives on control, adjustments, and reading defenses at a high level. But if that decision drags too far into the offseason, you're asking the rest of the offense to prepare without a defined identity at the most important position. That's not just an inconvenience. It directly impacts timing, chemistry, and overall execution once the season approaches. Now flip over to the defensive side, because this is where the tone of this team might actually be set. Patrick Graham didn't just outline a scheme, he hinted at a philosophical shift that could redefine how this defense operates snap to snap. The emphasis on a big nickel approach is more than just a formation tweak. It's about staying versatile without substituting, about controlling matchups, and about keeping speed and physicality on the field at the same time. This system leans heavily on hybrid players, guys who can blur the lines between positions. And the way the roster is currently constructed, you can see exactly why Graham is leaning in this direction. You've got defensive backs who can tackle like linebackers, safeties who can move like corners, and edge players who can consistently pressure without needing heavy blitz support. That allows the defense to stay in nickel looks while still defending the run effectively, something that traditionally forced teams into heavier packages. The real advantage here is unpredictability. Offenses won't get clear indicators pre-snap about what's coming. You can disguise pressure, rotate coverage, and adjust on the fly without changing personnel. That's how modern elite defenses operate, and if this system clicks, it has the potential to elevate this unit from simply solid to genuinely dominant. And that's not an exaggeration. There's a belief internally that this defense has the pieces to take a major leap, not just incremental improvement, but a real jump into that top-tier conversation. When you look at recent examples around the league, teams that made deep runs weren't just good defensively, they were adaptable, aggressive, and able to dictate terms. That's exactly what this scheme is designed to do, which brings everything full circle, because if this team does take that step defensively, then the entire equation around the offense changes. Suddenly, you don't need perfection on that side of the ball, you need efficiency, control, and timely execution. That's where a player like Rodgers, even at this stage, becomes incredibly valuable. Not because he has to carry the team, but because he can stabilize it. But again, it all comes back to timing. The longer the uncertainty lingers, the more pressure builds on every other decision the front office has to make. The draft picks, the depth chart, the system installation, it's all connected. And right now, the Steelers are walking a very fine line between calculated patience and potential overexposure to risk. At the same time, there's a sense of confidence in how they're handling it. This isn't a front office acting blindly. They've shown before that they're comfortable letting things play out, even if it creates discomfort externally. They trust their evaluations, they trust their structure, and clearly, they trust that this situation with Rodgers will resolve in a way that aligns with their plan. But here's the reality. If it doesn't, everything we've just talked about, from the quarterback room to the offensive identity to the overall ceiling of this team, starts to look very different very quickly. And that's where the tension really starts to build, because at some point this stops being about patience and starts being about commitment. You can feel that the Steelers are trying to keep every door open for as long as possible, but the closer you get to the heart of the offseason, when installs become real, when chemistry starts forming, when leadership naturally emerges, the harder it becomes to operate in uncertainty. If Aaron Rodgers does walk through that door, everything immediately makes sense. The offensive structure, the decision to remain flexible at quarterback, even the willingness to potentially move on from a steady presence like Mason Rudolph, it all aligns with a win-now approach that leans on experience and intelligence under center. You're not asking Rodgers to be the entire offense. You're asking him to be the piece that ties everything together while the defense does the heavy lifting. But if that doesn't happen, then the entire picture shifts. Suddenly, the development of younger players like Will Howard becomes the focal point. The margin for error shrinks. The offensive system that's being put in place might need to adapt on the fly rather than operate as originally envisioned. And those draft decisions, whether it's adding another quarterback, reinforcing the offensive line, or building depth elsewhere, become even more critical because they're no longer complementary moves, they're foundational ones. What's fascinating here is that Pittsburgh seems fully aware of that risk and is still choosing this path. That tells you there's a level of confidence not just in Rodgers potentially coming in, but in their ability to adjust if he doesn't. And historically, this is a franchise that doesn't panic. They don't overcorrect. They stick to their plan longer than most teams would feel comfortable doing. But the NFL doesn't always reward patience, it rewards timing. And right now, everything about this situation comes down to whether the Steelers are going to hit that timing window perfectly or miss it just enough for things to unravel. Because think about it, if Rodgers signs late but performs at a high level, this entire offseason will be viewed as calculated and brilliant. If he delays and then decides not to play, or if the team is forced to pivot too late, the same strategy suddenly looks like hesitation and missed opportunity. That's how thin the line is. And while all of that plays out, the rest of the roster is quietly being shaped. The defense is evolving into something more aggressive and modern. The offense is being structured around adaptability and quarterback control. The draft board is being set with multiple scenarios in mind. Everything is being built to either support a veteran-led push or pivot into a younger, developing core. So when you zoom out, this isn't just about one player or one decision. It's about the identity of the Pittsburgh Steelers heading into this next chapter. Are they a team taking one more calculated swing with a veteran quarterback, or are they laying the groundwork for something longer term that just hasn't fully revealed itself yet? That's why this moment matters so much, and why every move from here carries extra weight. Because the truth is, what happens next won't just define the offseason, it's going to shape the tone of the entire season before a single snap is played. And inside the building, even without a final answer at quarterback, the structure is already being put into place as if they know exactly what they're preparing for. You can see it in the way the offense is being discussed, in the confidence behind the system installation, and even in how the roster is being evaluated. There's a very real sense that the Steelers aren't scrambling, they're staging. They're setting the table for something they expect to happen, not something they're hoping might happen. And that distinction matters. If Aaron Rodgers does eventually commit, then everything we're watching right now becomes part of a carefully timed rollout. The delayed decision, the patience through the draft, the willingness to absorb outside criticism, it all turns into a strategic advantage. You preserve flexibility, you avoid forcing picks, and you allow the board to come to you instead of chasing needs. And that directly impacts how we should be looking at the draft itself. Because if the Steelers truly believe they have a strong chance of landing Rodgers, then they don't need to panic at quarterback early. That opens the door to focus on strengthening the roster in ways that elevate the entire team. The offensive line becomes a priority not out of desperation, but out of opportunity, especially on the interior, where stability can completely change how effective this offense becomes regardless of who